Welcome to Chapter 11, Hard Bop, Funky, Gospel Jazz. Straight ahead style that was very regressive. Okay, we've been making these charts and I hope they're helpful to give you things to listen to. And said another way for easy access, draw your attention to the playlist as we prepare for listening portion of the final exam. Here's your required listening for this term. Okay, and I think you're going to enjoy some of this. Some of the additional listening would be very helpful for you this week, and I'll talk about that as I go through the slides and the narrative. And we begin with funky. So it was first this quote, the funky idiom represented an attempt by the jazzman to rediscover his emotional roots. So keep that in mind as we go forward in this chapter. So funky was first called funky hard bop regression, but it was shortened to funky to capture the rollicking rhythmic feel. Okay, it was hard driving. Um, it was called funky hard bop regression. It got the hard because it was driving, and it got the bop regression because it was returned to the bop style. Okay, and you'll remember that musical styles swing like a pendulum, but not always smooth. It's more like but every time it swings, there's a gradual swing towards more complexity. And when we look back at some of the eras we've just come through, we see that in the swing era, they added musicians. In the bop era, they added extended harmonies and complicated melodies. And in the cool era they added new instruments, used different time signatures, extended the forms. But funky reverted, okay? It reverted backwards. So, going back to the funky, we see that it was also known as soul. And it was connected to the African American church and the emotionalism that's in the music in the African American church. Funky is a little more earthy than that, so there's a distinction between the church music or the gospel jazz and funky. But they both are highly rhythmical. They use simpler harmonies. They're happy. They're free of tension and frustrations. And they're linked through church harmonies and through the blues. Funky was a reaction to Cool's intellectualism, and it spread throughout jazz, this return to funk, okay? It relied on the oral tradition, on gospels, and on blues, more so than that intellectual compositional part that Cool had exploited. And very exuberant performances, very emotionally charged performances. And it's kind of interesting that the Cool was associated with this relaxed, laid back, kind of California coastal feeling, and that emerged on the West Coast, while on the East Coast you have that driving intensity of New York City, and that's where bop is mostly associated, okay? So we've already looked at both of those. The funky style was introduced by pianists, and um, a lot of folks see this as the African American um, effort to recapture jazz as their expression, okay? Because both in the swing era and in the cool era, there's been this feeling that white players have hijacked it and become more successful or reap more benefits from it. And so here we're more going back to roots, okay? Um, so going forward, point out to listen to the interactive guide, and we'll look at the music. So it was straight from the African American church, and it had a looser style. It used the blues scale. So those blue notes you'll remember in the scale are the third, the seventh, and in the bop era they added the fifth. Each of those, the flat third, flat seventh, and the flat fifth. The flat third and the flat seventh in our blues chapter a few weeks ago was mistuned. It didn't fit on the same note that you would play on the piano. Well, here it's not mistuned like it was in the blues era, but a lot of times to accommodate, to make it seem really flattered, they would play in minor keys. Okay? Gospel jazz was an extension of funk. It relied on simpler harmonies, especially that 1-4-1 plagal cadence. And to get that in your ear, if you've ever heard a hymn and at the end of the hymn you've heard them sing a long, extended Amen, that's the chord we're talking about. It'll be helpful for you here to listen to Les McCain's Fish This Week, or his A Little 3/4 for God and Company. And gospel jazz usually is accompanied by hand clapping, so it's kind of participatory. Like I said, it was first known as soul jazz, but then they felt like gospel jazz was a better term for that. And now we move to the performers. Okay, so we're going to talk here in just a minute about Art Blakey and his jazz messengers, of which Horace Silver was one. But funky originally was introduced by pianists and soon was taken over by instrumentalists. Okay, Horace Silver was a pianist who was considered the progenitor of funk. His style was described as slow or medium blues, played hard on the beat, had a heavy feeling. It kind of harkened back to the old blues style. And Don Heckman observes that jazz in the 1960s was a blues-based form. It used blues-based chords, blues-based forms, riffs, rhythms that you would have heard in the 1920s and 1930s. And it took that and it morphed it into the idiom of the contemporary small group style. And there were imitators of it who just simplified it to superficialities. So this music was closely related to expressions of the African American or Negro past and rooted in the right here, right now of the 1960s, which was, you'll remember, the Civil Rights Movement. Bop elements faded while funk elements developed, and especially the afterbeat. So listen to The Preacher, which is a Horace Silver composition, okay? Next person up is Cannonball Adderley. He was a saxophone player, an alto saxophone player of hard bop. He was blues-based. He was initially working with Ray Charles way back, and then he joined Miles Davis in 1957. And he played with this power-packed group, Miles and John Coltrane, which we see also a little later in this week. Or that's who's up next in this same week. And that was a power-packed group when Miles Davis and he were together. In fact, I remind you, they turned out some incredible albums, Milestones, Kind of Blue, and also one that we haven't mentioned, Portrait of Cannonball. In the 1960s, Cannonball left Miles' group and formed his own quintet with his brother Nat, who was a trumpeter. I'm going to refer you to additional listening, Mercy, 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 which is very indicative of funky music, a very good example of funky. Be aware that his career spanned from cool, the Miles Davis era in the 50s, to funky, that we're listening to here, to avant-garde, and all the way into jazz rock. His music was always popular with casual listener. One of the features of the funky era was this new instrument, the Hammond B3 organ, which relied on these Leslie speakers that revolved and changed the sound as they revolved. So it's a very distinctive feature of this era. So when you hear that, you know you're listening to funky or gospel jazz, okay? And it was another thing, another feature, this instrument that was from the African American church that came into funky music. Let's take a look here at Art Blakey that I've mentioned. His group, the Jazz Messengers, was very important in this era, and it came at the tail. This group formed at the tail of the hard bop movement and became jazz mainstream. So it was a more accessible format, and the group existed basically to bring young players in and to train them to use their personal voice and to be in the tradition of jazz and also to become adept at improvising. Art Blakey was a drummer, and he just launched a number of new players over his careers by giving them a chance to play in his group, the Jazz Messengers. And some of the players that came through there were Horace Silver, Freddie Hubbard, the trumpet player, Wayne Shorter, which we've discussed already, Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, Kenny Dorham, and two of the Marsalis brothers, Winton and Branford. So listen to ETA to get a sense of them. Blakey was active all the way up until his death in 1990. And another player that we're going to look at here is Clifford Brown, who is a trumpet player who left an indelible mark on bop and the transition to hard bop. He recorded for 4 years and had a career. He was influenced heavily by Dizzy Gillespie and Fats Navarro, both trumpet players that we've looked at already. He also played fast tempo upbeat solos, and he was very expressive on ballads. He formed his own quintet with Max Roach, And he leaves a large legacy, even though he was only active in recording for 4 years because he died young in a car accident at age 25. One of these legacies is a tribute to him called I Remembered Clifford. It's in the additional listing. And this was written by Benny Golson. There's also a Clifford Brown Jazz Festival that's held every year in Wilmington, Delaware. Next person we want to take a look at is Sonny Rollins, a tenor sax player who's been influential from the late 1950s. I believe he's still alive. And he improvised his melodies, just disregarding the chord structure that everybody up till now had paid attention to. And he also disregarded those 16 bar solos, 32 bars, 64 bars, 124 bar solos, where you kind of have a specific time to improvise in. He just threw all of that away and expanded an idea for however long it took, even if it took 20 or 30 minutes. Kind of like Haydn or Mozart or Beethoven, classical composers expanding an idea and playing with it. He was full of cool and bop elements. There's several additional listening pieces that might be helpful to you: Limehouse Blues, St. Thomas, and Doxy. He was a matic of thematic improvisation using little fragments, and you'll remember that that Thelonious Monk introduced fragments. Well, after Sonny Rollins used it on the tenor sax, a lot of other instrumentalists imitated that as well. He retired twice in his career to just go practice. Once was from 1959 to 1961, and another was in 1969. His favorite place to practice was right out in public at the top of the Williamsburg Bridge in New York City. Listen to Blue 7, please. And let's take a look at bass player Charles Mingus. He worked with Louis Armstrong and Kid Ory, so he also goes way back, and his career also spans into free jazz, which we get to in another week or so. And there's some additional listening that will help you out with him too. He was definitely bop and hard bop, but he also incorporated a wild birth of other idioms and styles. He was very adept at conveying emotion. Most groups encourage players to develop their own individual style, their own individual statement, be very distinctive, but Mingus was entirely the opposite. He wanted all of his players to make a unified statement, to be on the same page and have the same emotional impact. And we're going to listen to the Haitian Fight song. He said to play this song that he had to call on his feelings about prejudice, hate, and persecution, and he called on his players to do the same. There's also some additional listening that you'll probably enjoy: Bitter Get It in Your Soul and Hora Decubitus. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Charles Mingus' intensity is seldom matched in jazz. He worked in that gap between that European style of composition and that African American style of improvisation. He was a constant experimental in the main street of jazz's evolution, and he influenced it heavily, as did the players that he launched and introduced. He also had some quirks about him. He was known for stopping in mid-performance to correct things. For example, to talk to his players about the compositional idea and make sure he corrected it to what he wanted in that particular piece, and also to correct the audience and scold them for not listening. To sum up this unit, you could say that hard bop returns to the tradition from which jazz came, and it respects that long jazz tradition. So it was definitely a reversion from cool, bringing it back to traditional jazz. We've got one more unit, John Coltrane. So we'll see you in that real soon.